Today's conversation is on choosing a thesis lab. We know that there are a number of students who are in this really sort of pivotal moment of thinking about what lab is right for them. And COVID has sort of changed the process and changed the thinking of our students. And so for today, we are going to talk about two things. One is what are we seeing? And two is what are we encouraging people in terms to do in terms of how to conceptualize, how to make a choice, how to think about their choices. And really, I think at its core, how to make a choice that really kind of is a good fit for their values and their goals. Today, joining me on this conversation from the OCPD team is Program Manager, Dr. Rachel Kerr, and Program Director, Dr. Lawrence Clement. And we also have with us Dr. Deanne Duncan, who is Assistant Dean for Diversity and Learner Success at UCSF. Thank you all for being here. Okay, so let's get into problem identification first. Rachel, what are we seeing?
Yeah, so mainly what's happening is that labs have shut down, and so third rotations are not happening as planned. So some students are joining one of the first two rotations labs that they did if they have a good fit, and other students are doing a third rotation either online if the science allows for that, or pushing it until later when labs reopen, whenever that is. And programs seem to be expecting that students, like the next cohort of students is still going to come in the fall. And so the current first year students need to be placed in their labs by the time that that happens, and then proceed on with their qualifying exams. So for the most part, we have students who are either deciding between what they already know and not getting new data, or students who are trying to collect new data about labs, but now without actually being in the lab in person.
Okay, so this is open for everybody, what are we recommending for students who are thinking about sort of doing a third rotation, even if they're doing it virtually? There's this question, which is really common, which is how am I supposed to actually assess a lab if I can't physically be in the lab? So Lawrence, what are we encouraging people to do?
So as you've said before, a lab is not just a physical place, it's also a group of people, it's a community. And so if you're not going to be able to be there physically, you're going to need opportunities for yourself and ask for opportunities for yourself to interact with as many people as possible in as many different contexts as possible, right? So examples of this would be attending as many lab meetings, virtual lab meetings as possible, or other types of meetings, journal clubs, other, any types of meetings that happen that involve the lab, and really paying attention to how people interact in these environments. It'll be also useful to ask to meet with graduate students and postdocs, specific people, particularly maybe, to meet with them a few times or on a regular basis, to interact with them and see how you work with them. And so even having opportunities to work together, to work on a project together, to analyze data, to discuss a paper, anything that could be an equivalent of a job simulation can give you a chance to actually interact with people. So even if your topic of research is not very amenable to actually working online and doing an online rotation, you could put a lot of things in place that could simulate that. And actually, I'll throw it back to Rachel, who has brought up a really good point, which was that when you are interacting with people online, exclusively online, you want to be really specific sometimes about what you want from them or what you want to learn from them. And this is where, understanding your values is important. But I want to just kind of throw this back to Rachel.
Yeah, and I think we'll get to that more in a little bit. And I just want to say first that I think it's really important. This whole situation has kind of made it even more clear, something that I always bring up with students, which is that the point of a rotation is not to collect data and get a result, maybe for an abstract or half of a paper or whatever it is. The point of a rotation is to collect the data that you need, not about the projects, but about the actual lab environment, because the projects are going to change, but the lab environment is what's going to be there the whole time during your thesis. So the important part isn't really the science data, it's more the environment, the personnel, the communication, interaction, that kind of data. And so I would argue that a lot of that can actually be done remotely, even when you can't be flipping flies or tending to mice or whatever the science would have entailed. So there's still hope to collect important data, I think now, remotely. And one way to make sure that that happens is by really making clear to yourself first what your goals are, both for the lab that you want to join and for the information that you want to know in order to figure out which lab you want to join. So we will add it to the links for this video, but there's a slide deck and a handout from the Choosing Your Thesis Lab programs that we did before COVID, which kind of help you list out what your preferences and goals are, what your options are, and kind of what the weighting values are that you have that will help you decide which lab's going to be the best fit. And I think doing that is as important now as ever, and can really help you kind of create a map for the information that you want to learn from the people in the lab in order to make your decision. And then every time you are able to set up a conversation, maybe you say, I want to make sure I have 20-minute one-on-ones with everyone in the lab. When you come to that conversation, you know, like, I need to learn, how did this person come up with their thesis lab project? What was it like when they were writing their first paper? And whatever else is, you know, did they do teaching, have a teaching experience, and how did that go? Talking about that with the PI. And then you make sure you get that information from that conversation, and kind of all of the in-between happenstance stuff that happens throughout the day of the lab isn't there, but you're still able to get the information that you need. So you sit down with that person and you say, thank you so much for meeting with me. I'm really excited that I can still talk with you even though this lab is not physically meeting. These are the things that I'd like to talk with you about, and you get right to it. So you knowing what it is you want from the interactions that you have online, I think are really key to getting the, being able to make the decision that's going to be right for you in the end.
And I think that's a really good point, that one of the lovely things, if there's anything lovely about COVID, is that it's entirely kind of opened the landscape about how you actually interview or assess a lab. So this idea about sort of that you're going to specifically choose to meet with 20 people and to, I think, as you were saying, Lawrence, like upfront say, like, I really just have some key questions that's going to help me make a decision, is something that you can actually say as compared to just sort of observing sort of what's happening in the lab. And the lovely thing is that you can actually sort of ask every single person in the lab the exact same questions, and then basically look at the entire data set. And are you getting thorough answers? Are you getting detailed answers? Are you getting the same types of answers?
We have also slides about how to use an interview to determine whether a workplace is a good fit for you. And that outlines a lot how you can ask questions and how you can listen to the answer in a way to really get good data about what's happening in the workplace that you're interviewing at. So we'll link to those too, because those are going to be key now.
How do you give an opportunity for people to assess you for whether or not you're the right fit for them, especially if they've never thought about it and they've never really conceived it, and maybe they're still not conceiving it as you're coming in? How can you encourage them to make their decision without the physical component?
It is worth asking the question that sort of says, what are you looking for in candidates who you invite to join your lab in terms of qualities, expertise, skills, and has COVID changed that in any way for you, right? Because for some, I think that if I just sort of put on a PI's kind of supervisor hat, right? If they're concerned about productivity, it means that over the next year, they're going to have to kind of think about how they're going to quote unquote make up time, right? And so before, it might not have been as important, or they might have felt they had more time to teach something, while now they may sort of wish that you sort of already had this technique and you have it down and you're ready to go. And so just trying to see at a baseline in every sort of situation, like, what are they looking for? And yes, people will always say productivity. And so it's helpful to then just kind of unpack that a little bit in terms of using previous examples. So like, what types of productivity have you seen people sort of achieve in during their rotation, which has basically sort of said to you, this is the highest caliber student. And the thing is that you're going to hear everything from PIs who are like, the person basically like was first there in the morning and didn't leave till the end of the day, while other people may actually have like a tangible kind of outcome, as in, we said we would work on X project, this person did X project, and then they were also able to do Y and Z. So understanding a little bit about sort of what resonates for the PI is going to be really key. And then there's this extra piece about what their thinking is and how far their thinking has advanced about how they are going to manage the impact of COVID. It is reasonable to just sort of ask them sort of like where their current thinking is at, or how their thoughts have evolved about productivity expectations based on, you know, really sort of considering the impact of COVID, and knowing that those thoughts may not be, you know, sort of fully developed, but even sort of understanding a little bit about what their current thinking is helpful as well. You know, what does, you know, how have performance expectations been set for you? What does your PI value in terms of productivity? What is recognized and rewarded here? And what, if anything, has changed in terms of those expectations because of COVID?
This particular student was completing their third rotation, and the lab shut down. We shifted the sheltering in place while that student was in the lab. And one of the things that the student recognized or observed was that the PI was led the lab very well based off her standards and her expectations. The student felt like the PI was very communicative. The PI set expectations in terms of saying, if you don't want to work on this project, you don't have to. If you just want to read a paper, that's cool too. The PI was willing to meet this particular student and the rest of the lab where they were, and met them in their mindset. And for that student, that was everything. And they really appreciated that. And so I would say, you know, on top of, you know, everything that we just mentioned, I think if you were in a lab, rotating in a lab when that lab transitioned into shelter in place, that might be how the PI led the lab during that transition. Observe it and kind of think about those factors, or think about what you observed, and let that influence your decisions. And if you're rotating in a new lab, you were not able to observe the transition, I think it's okay for you to ask when you're going on your interviews and collecting data, collecting information from the different lab members. I think it's okay for you to ask, how is the transition? How is the lab's transition home? How was the transition to shutting down? How were your experiments? How did you feel? How was the PI supportive of all of you during that transition?
And so there is this piece about kind of seeing two things. One, how does your PI handle a crisis, right? Because other sort of challenges will come up in the future. And I think it's great to actually kind of ask, and I think the students and postdocs, and the way to frame it is to just say, you know, what are the things that really resonate with you about how your PI handled this challenge or handled this transition? Because it's an open-ended question enough that's not leading. It just allows the space for the student or postdoc to share what they're comfortable sharing. And also, if they feel that their PI did something really fantastic, is to say it. And if nobody says anything fantastic, also is a data point. But I think that this piece about just kind of really still grounded in your values about what you were looking for in a lab, and allowing students and postdocs to kind of, and the PI to tell you about their experience, and then kind of reflecting on whether or not you feel that your values were reflected in those actions and those decisions is really huge, right? Like, this is sort of how you figure out if you're not just in a productive lab, but in a lab that's also a good fit for you.
Sometimes the students don't have a relationship for particular PIs, and they're not feeling well from the day to day. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. There's things, they're bombarded by the news. They may hear news from family members, friends around COVID. Mm-hmm. And so I was just wondering if, I just wanted to hear everyone's thoughts around how can students communicate to their the PIs that they're rotating with around these other feelings, and how can that be used as a metric, for lack of a better word, to assess the lab?
In light of that, there is this, I think, interesting thing about how PIs are assessing, like, assessing like what level of productivity a person can reasonably expect, in general, there's not necessarily one way to expect it or one way to assess it, but just to understand that in a crisis, you basically need to kind of shorten your time frame to basically kind of see, you know, what's going on this week, what level of productivity is reasonable to expect this week, and how do I support you in kind of meeting that level of productivity. So I do think that what I would look for just at the baseline level is whether or not during the interview, the PI actually asks you how COVID has affected you, right? Like just asking, just caring enough to ask, which I know for some people, because, you know, holding that, the emotional labor of holding that and the trauma that could come with that answer feels so overwhelming that in some cases people are like, I don't want to ask, I can't ask. I'm really hoping that like student health can like handle that for you. But I do think there's this, that one of the qualities that I would hope in anybody who's in a supervisory role is that they have the ability to recognize that asking does not mean that they are somehow on the hook for actually responding or solving the issue. And Deanne, I'd like to turn to you because one of the things that I think sometimes students don't really think about is like, what are the common mistakes that students make?
Sure. Thanks for that, Nalidi. I think one of the big mistakes that I often hear and have to coach students through is really assessing the lab solely on the research and their level of interest related to the research project. What's life gonna look like? What's your life in the lab gonna look like when life happens? And right now we're living in a situation in a pandemic where life happens, and there are other factors that are impacting or influencing the decision. And so I often turn to assessment of, as we already mentioned before, the community, and whether or not students can bring their whole authentic self to the lab. In other words, making sure that who they are scientifically and who they are personally, with all of their identities, particularly during this time, will be celebrated and welcomed when they come into the lab.
Just letting your values still be really important. I think we've been hearing some pressure that people might be feeling to choose from one of the two labs that they have done rotations in. Maybe you're feeling like this third rotation is going to be not even in the lab, not even in person. Maybe I won't get good data. Maybe it'll just be crappy anyway, and it'll be a waste of my time. Maybe I should just join a lab now, because I that's what I know, and then it'll be certain, and I'll be joined, and it'll be great. And I would just draw from my own experience. So I was also a neuroscience PhD, also UCSF, and I also switched labs. So I chose a thesis lab twice. So I can tell you how to do it and how not to do it. And it's just really important to keep in mind that you're going to be here for 5 years after this decision, and that those 5 years really deserve you taking the time now to make a decision that's going to sit well with you, and not necessarily one that's being driven more from a place of anxiety. So if you can just take a little space and see, is that pressure coming from just really being having a hard time sitting with that uncertainty, or is it coming from a financial perspective or something else? But just to really kind of figure out, where is that coming from, and is that really going to be a bigger factor in the end than maybe spending 5 years in a lab that's not such a great fit, or realizing 1 year in that it's actually not even going to work at all and you are going to need to switch. And a fourth point that's just come up from that, we have also ideas for how to help you if you know that you're making a decision that's not going to be perfect for you. Also in that same slide deck for using the interview to tell if the workplace is a good fit or not, because of course we all know that none of these fits are going to be perfect. And so you're going to make a decision that's going to be like, it's going to be super great on this, this, and this, and it's going to be lacking this. And if you know that going in, you can come up with strategies to try to make sure that that's not going to take you down.
Right. Lawrence.
I want to address two things. First, you all talked about the fact that some people, and especially Rachel brought this up, about the fact that some people will have the opportunity, or are being told right now there might be an opportunity to postpone the last rotation to later.
Right.
And I want to point to the fact that it's a really uncertain time. We do not know if that last rotation will in fact happen. There's been, kind of a misalignment between what in many organizations leadership has said would be the return time from the start, and even like whether or not there would be a shutdown, right, in the beginning. So we don't know these timelines will actually be able to be followed. And so what I would recommend with people about the decision-making process is that if they're thinking, ooh, this online, this virtual rotation sounds like a really complicated way of finding a lab, and it's making me feel insecure and I'd rather wait for something that's more sure, I would also encourage them to think about how they will make their decision if this last rotation can't happen in person, right? So just be ready to make your decision. And if you feel like it's better not to have the virtual one and you'd rather keep the ones that you've already done and choose between those two, that's how you'll make your decision. But I'd like people to kind of, and that's kind of the encouragement the advice I've been giving across the board to people right now. When they're interviewing for faculty positions, when they're interviewing for different types of positions, is start thinking now about how you will make your decision depending on what happens, the different types of scenarios.
Lady was talking about how it's a good time to be able to see what people's values really are, because everyone's stressed right now. And I think that it's also a good time for you to reflect on what your values are. I know, maybe in the absence of having to do a bunch of busy work in the animal towers or whatever it is, you can take 45 minutes or half an hour with a cup of tea and just kind of really do some looking inside and figure out what are the things that are important to you, and then do it again in a week. Maybe things have changed. Get some data on yourself and take some time after you've had some conversations with people in the lab, reflecting again, like, is that what's important to me? That's what was important to them. What can I weigh that against experiences that I had in past labs, whether that was important to me or not? That this kind of isolation time can be useful for some people to turn in and be able to listen to yourself.
And just as a note, you can also flip that in that you can also just do a series of interviews and look at the data and then sort of reflect on whether or not you're seeing yourself reflected, right? So if you're sort of like, I can't do it in a vacuum, you don't have to. It's really just thinking about how can I make the best choices based on the resources I have, the time that I have, the energy that I have, my goals, to make the best choice for me. And COVID just basically complicates that exponentially, but the core piece is still the same. How do I get as close as possible to my definition of a good decision? And how do I use the resources and support around me to support me?
Two things about that community and support that the lady was just talking about at the end. We have a slide deck on finding your 5 mentors that we can link to. And I also want to just bring up the idea of engaging your community. I say this in the Choosing Your Thesis Lab program normally, but it's even more important now. Engaging the community that you would have engaged to make this decision now, and how also kind of weirdly proactive that has to be, because you're not going to bump into them. You got to send that email. So, and the people who maybe some of you have like faculty advisors, and maybe you know who they are, maybe they don't, maybe you don't, maybe they've never reached out to you. It's totally valid to email them and say like, hey, you're my faculty advisor. This is the decision I'm making, and I'd like to have a 15-minute conversation with you about this. They can say no, but it's up to you to reach out to people. I think to some extent, but at NoCPD, we're really thinking a lot about the population that we serve, but I think a lot of people are working on their own stuff and having a hard time keeping tabs on what everyone else is up to. So wave your flag and reach out to the people that help you make decisions.
So with that, that is sort of our general overview question about sort of how to choose a thesis lab, plus sort of adding this extra kind of COVID factor in terms of sort of choosing a lab. What you can sort of hear, I think, is that all of those same processes and all of those same kind of decisions and considerations should actually be taken in, should still be taken into consideration. And there might just be a little bit, but the way you find out that information might have changed. and also your feeling that you have the ability to sort of engage in additional exploration may or may not be the case right now. But in all cases, we are here to support you. We'll make sure that we actually kind of list how to make a counseling appointment and how to get in touch with Deanne if you've got questions, because I do think that it's not unreasonable for a student or postdoc or student to basically want to practice a question, how to kind of frame questions to really not sound as if you're just thinking of yourself, but at the same time not getting your questions answered. And so so we've got some strategies around that. So I'll thank Deanne and Lawrence and Rachel for this great conversation. So we'll see you soon, and take care, everyone.